wish I had a little bit of that, like, you're not a very good speaker, you're super boring, and then it'd be totally different if I got up to you, but now the bar's at this level. Thanks, Andrew. I love you too. So I want to have you imagine just really quickly, imagine you're on a timeline. So we have 8 kids in our house. We brought them all here because some of you guys like being youth leaders, and you brought all the kids from your youth group here. Try bringing your own kids to youth convention. It's not as much fun, but we're having fun. But there's times, I think, in life where we look at things a little bit linearly, where we're on a timeline, and there's things that happen that marks kind of a significant moment in our life, right? So the birth of our first kid. We went through some really hard times about 5 years ago, significant moment. And in those moments, I think we can kind of get into this, I don't know if you call it kind of a trough or a V or whatever, but you kind of get into that moment and you start to sink deeper into that cultural moment. So in those moments, I call it a cultural moment, but it's just basically like a moment where you kind of sit in it, and the more you sit in it, the more you think about it, the deeper things kind of end up going. You try to understand that moment from that, or try to understand what's going on. How did we get to this place? What other areas does this affect? All of those things are things that we think about as we're sitting kind of in that moment. There's a lot of cultural moments that kind of come along, and this topic, specifically in transgender identity, is a huge one right now. There's some statistics out right now. Gallup did a recent poll. They found 1 in 6 Gen Z that are 18 to 24. 1 in 6 Gen Z, 18 to 24, will say that they're LGBTQ+. That's how they identify. That's where they find their identity. Arizona Christian just did another recent study. They found that it was it 4 in 10 out of the Arizona Christian study. So I have 8 kids. That means that this is statistically going to be a reality for me. But there's a fun quote that I heard that said, statistics aren't inevitable for individuals, but they do show the pathway of a society, of a culture. And so this statistic, I think for us, as we're thinking through this, is really important. But it became a little bit more alive to me because I read this Twitter thread. How many of you read, like when you see something on Twitter, you just get sucked into the Twitter thread? You just go deeper and deeper, and you're like, oh, that was the biggest. Those minutes aren't getting back to my life. That's gone. But this one is really intense. If you've been following Twitter, there's a lot of people that have been coming out, and kind of like there's a big movement inside of Twitter for people that are detransitioning out of LGBTQ plus IA, all of that lifestyle. This is one that I read just because I think it kind of sets the game, a little bit of the narrative for us. And this person, their name's Tulip R. He had surgery. He was born a male, had surgery to become a female at the age of 25, and has since now come, and he's starting a group in England to now change the narrative that they have. In England, if you're following this, which I tend to do, follow these weird things in culture, England is starting to change the way that they're looking at transgender surgery specifically. They're not doing it for kids in the same way that we would be advocating here in the States. And some of it has to do because more people have come out. And this is one, I'm just going to read this. This is a little bit graphic. So plug your ears or complain to Andrew after that. Is that okay? But this person says, I want to tell everyone what they took from us and what irreversible really means and what it looks like in reality. No one had told me this before I had my surgery. So he goes on throughout the course of this. He says this, I have no sensation in my crotch region at all. You could stab it with a knife, I wouldn't know. The entire area is numb. It's like shell-shocked, unable to comprehend what happened, even 4 years on. He says, I tore a suture 4 days post-recovery. They promised to address it, and I begged them in emails to fix it. They scorned me instead, and years later, it looks like I have a chunk of flesh missing out of my neo-vagina. It literally looks like someone just hacked at me. He continues on, no one told me that the base area of your penis is left. It can't be removed, meaning that you're left with a literal stump inside that twitches. When you take testosterone and your libido returns, you wake up with morning wood without the tree. He says, I wish this was a joke, but it's not. He continues on, and if you take testosterone after being post-op, You run the risk of internal hair in the neo-vagina. Imagine dealing with internal hair growth after everything. What a choice. Be healthy on testosterone and a freak, or remain a sexless eunuch. He continues on, and that's something that will never come back for me. One reason why I got the surgery. My sex drive died about 6 months ago on HRT, and at that time I was glad to be rid of it. But now 10 years later I'm realizing what I'm missing out on, and I won't go back, and it won't go back. He continues on, because even if I had a sex drive, my neo-vagina is so narrow and small, I wouldn't even be able to have sex if I wanted to. And when I do use a small dilator, I have random pockets of sensation, only to see that be pain rather than pleasure. He continues on, any pleasure I do have comes from the prostate that was moved forward and wrapped in glands from the penis, meaning that anal sex isn't really possible and it risks further damage. He ends his Twitter thread with this, now I get to the point where I'm detransitioned and the realization is this, that it's permanent, and that reality is catching up with me. He says, during the transition, I was obsessed and deeply unwell. I cannot believe they were allowed to do this to me, even after all of the red flags. So it's a little bit of the reality of what we're talking about when we talk about this. That's the physical side of this reality, that nobody really, I shouldn't say nobody really, because I just did for you guys, and you're probably all like, you don't like Wayne anymore, because he brought us through this. But there is this reality that happens. And it's part of the reality, I think, for us as we're walking through this timeline. And this thing, for many of us, in the last 5 years, Al, I don't think in 1977 this was a seminar topic at YC, right? But there's a reality for us that we're sitting inside of this cultural moment, and this thing, we're being pulled deeper and deeper into the cultural moment. And we look around kind of the cultural moment, and we try to make sense of how do we get ourselves at least out of this cultural moment? How do we fix this for my kids? And we end up looking inside of this cultural moment, kind of around at different things in culture. So there's this guy, Ian McGilchrist. He's a psychologist out of England. He has some really amazing things to say about culture right now. He says, he kind of talks about the brain and the hemispheres of the brain, and he says, we've essentially been leaning too heavily on one of the sides of the brain as a culture, where we look at everything, kind of like Daniel would say, a little bit with the law gospel side, where we're trying to convince people to stop doing something because we're bringing out all the facts about it. We're going to hit them over the head that this is wrong, this is a fact about it, and so you should know that this is going to be what it's like when we get to that end. However, my friend Tulip here didn't jump in to do this because he had read a science book about what this meant for him later on in life. There was a narrative that captured his heart. And that narrative caused him to look at the world differently, and to assess it differently, to analyze it differently, and then to make this drastic change in his life to try to fix something that was missing. And it's a reality for us that there's a narrative that's capturing the imagination of our culture. And I think sometimes when we sit inside of these cultural moments, we try to think of a way as a youth leader to get out of these cultural moments, we'll start latching on to things, maybe like Ian McGilchrist would be, where we're looking at something like a cultural movement, or maybe I could capture their imagination, or I could get them to maybe crave to be, at least in a heterosexual relationship, or maybe even marriage. So how can I capture their imagination to pull them out of this cultural moment, at least my youth group kids? Because if we can pull our youth group kids out of this cultural moment, then we'll have some semblance of success, because this is a huge movement that's happening right now. 4 and 10 kids in this age group that are falling into this narrative that their identity is based in their sex. And I would say, I don't know if Christian Anderson, is he in here? He heard I was speaking, so he didn't come. No, I'm just joking. His session today, his session today was awesome. And when we talk about building a narrative, his session today, I think, kind of did that. It built a narrative, I think, for our kids to have this understanding. But sometimes we get into these cultural moments, we get deep down in them, and we look around and we want to latch on to somebody's scientific research to try to pull us up to get our head above it. And I think I kind of use this analogy that we're in this cultural moment, and there's these threads of narratives that are running above us. Sometimes these threads might be things like science, scientific research, so we'll grab onto that thread and we'll try to pull ourselves or pull our kids out of this cultural moment. Or we'll do it based on some kind of like political or socioeconomic thread, and we'll say, your life will be better if you get married. And so we're going to pull ourselves out of this cultural moment from that reality. And there's something that happened to me, it was probably 6 months ago, where this mental picture was actually brought a little bit more to life, because all of those threads I'd always tried to pull myself out of. But there's a larger thread that hangs at the top, and it's the gospel. It's the 4 chapters, like the 3-chapter story, the 4-chapter story that Eric brought us through today. The creation, the fall, the redemption, restoration. What does that look like for our kids? And I think what Eric did today with presenting it for our kids, what Ian McGilchrist will say, and some of the other people that I've read on this topic, is that these narratives are driving, and we're looking to kind of capture onto them. The more that we can tell the gospel, especially in a way that you've been created, you were created good, God said that, the fall is real and it sucks and it impacts you in powerful ways. Redemption is offered through Jesus, and he invites you then into his beautiful story to be a part of that. And that compelling message is told in 4 real relationships. That message, the creation message, hits me internally like myself. It also, the creation message impacts my relationship to God. It impacts my relationship to you. It impacts how I handle the earth. The fall does that too. The fall has those 4 relationships. Redemption has those 4 relationships. Restoration, what we're called into then, has those 4 relationships. And somebody, it was 6 months ago, gave me that picture that when we look at this cultural moment, we sit in it and we get pulled deeper and deeper, and we kind of get into this place of despair where we look around and we say, nothing good can come from this cultural moment. There's just so much that's pulling us down. It's pulling like a vortex, like everything down into it. But what we see in the gospel is that this reality, this 4-chapter story of the gospel, this narrative, it hooks into the bottom of the cultural moment and pulls it up. And I think, this is my impression, that as we do that, rather than a cultural moment, it ends up being a cultural inflection point for us. And especially as we look at this reality of transgender identity and these like struggles and all of this, that there is this reality that the narrative of the gospel isn't, like Daniel said, it's not just the laws and the do's and the don'ts, but there's a narrative of God knowing us in a unique and powerful way. And Christian hit it home. Is he doing it again tomorrow? Yeah, if you can, grab those green tickets or copy somebody's green ticket and just scribble it up on his session. Because the way that he explained your identity and your identity being in Christ was phenomenal. And that's, I think, with these kids, with Tulip, he realized that his identity isn't just his sexual identity, but it messed up all of his sexual identity, all of his sexual experience for him. But there's still a Christian storyline. There's a gospel storyline there, even for him, in what redemption looks like and what restoration looks like. And so I want to just close with this. We've got eight kids in our house right now, and they're crazy. And I apologize to my wife a lot because they're a lot like me. But inside of that relationship, there's a reality that I'm not, especially as a dad, I feel like the pressure to be successful. And I don't know if you guys feel like that as a youth leader. I have my own youth group at home, but that's sometimes how I feel. That there's this pressure to be successful, to have my kids wear the right clothes to church or what have you, or all those different things. And last year, a friend of mine said that God's call on us, and it's actually something that was on Chuck Colson's desk. He was part of Watergate and then had this amazing worldview ministry and prison ministry. On Chuck Colson's desk, there was this placard that said, faithfulness, not success. And that changed a lot of the way that I was reading through Scripture even. When God calls somebody, I think he calls them to be faithful and not necessarily successful. So as we look at this and these things are going to happen in our youth group, we're going to be pulled down to these cultural moments. I think the calling for God in these moments is actually faithfulness, not necessarily and success is whatever we base it on, right? But maybe my success is more in being faithful to tell that gospel story, to impassionately engage my kids in that way, and to know that they're going to struggle with their gender identity. Some of them may never feel heterosexual. They may never have those commitments in that same way. That doesn't mean that they've lost now the picture of what it means to honor God with their identity. They can still honor God with their identity. God's love and grace and redemption still impacts them and can impact that, I believe. So as we look at that, that's kind of what I want to share with you today, that these moments are narratives that drive us deep into a cultural moment. But as we understand the gospel as a narrative, it actually is powerful enough, I think, to turn these places where we wallow and pray, Lord Jesus, come quickly, and it turns it actually into a cultural inflection point. So that's what I have for you.